Napoli fans around the world, welcome to Napoli Talk. First of all, I want to wish you guys a very, very happy new year. Let's hope that 2024 brings us lots of joy and lots of success. And it's crazy to think that only a few months ago we were enjoying a very successful 2023, an unforgettable 2023. But things are quite different this year, with the team struggling to get points, struggling to win at home. But let's take a look at whether or not the accusations that some people are making towards this team are actually true, or whether this team has simply been extremely unlucky. So today, guys, I'm going to ask you three things. Number one, smash that like button. Number two, subscribe if you haven't. And number three, go pause the video and pick up some of your reading glasses because you might need it for this video. We'll be looking at a lot of data. We will be comparing Napoli Monza, which ended 0-0 from last weekend, to Napoli Spezia last year under Spalletti, which ended 1-0 with a goal in the 90th minute by Raspadori. Why did I pick these two games? Simply because in both these two games, we were playing at home against the team in the bottom half of the table. And most importantly, it was two games without Victor Osimhen. This time he's off on suspension. Last time he was away injured. But very comparable games and circumstances. So it's important to take a look at how those teams compare from last year to this year. So let's get right into it. Right, let's take a look at, first of all, just what happened overall last year. Here's a very simple timeline of events, and you can see that Raspadori in Napoli Spezia scored in the 89th minute. Now, there's a few things I want you guys to note, and the first one is let's take a look at the Gaetano substitution. So in Napoli Monza 2023, Gaetano came on for Zielinski in the 71st minute. And the difference between that time and this time is that Gaetano had a match winning ball in the 90th minute and couldn't make it into a goal. Whereas last time he came on and actually gave Raspadori the assist for the goal. But at the end of the day, it's fine margins. And so a lot of people are saying, why are we playing with guys like Gaetano? Mazzarri doesn't understand anything. Well, guys, Spalletti in a game that was 0-0 made a very similar substitution and it happened to work out for him last time. So it's not about the specific players that are on the field or not. Sometimes it's just a matter of luck. And this time Gaetano felt the pressure a little bit too much. Last year, when things were going slightly better for Napoli, maybe he was a little bit less under pressure and actually delivered a match-winning assist. Now let's take a look at some of the other things that happened that we can maybe criticize Mazzarri for. And before we do that, we have to take a look at what Spalletti did with his general substitutions last year. And we can see that when it was 0-0, Spalletti was super proactive in making changes at the stroke of halftime and two within the 60th minute. So we had already, by the 60th minute, three different substitutions. We ended up using the complete bench. And those substitutions ended up changing the game. Whereas Mazzarri this year was reactive, and it was Monza with Palladino that was more proactive, making the first three substitutions within, let's say, the hour mark, more or less. And then Mazzarri responded with three of his own, but only from the 70th minute onwards. So a full 25 minutes or 30 minutes after Spalletti made his first substitution, did Walter Mazzarri then end up making his own. Now, is that actually something to do with the coach's mentality? One being a bit more proactive and one being a bit more reactive? Yes and no. The people on the bench are completely different this year compared to last year. First of all, we are short of Elmas, for example, in the midfield. We are also short of one of our, let's say, starting right wingers, such as Politano. Last year, Spalletti in this Napoli Spezia game had a more complete midfield on his bench. He also had the option of both Lozano and Politano on the right wing, whereas this year we only had Lindstrom on the bench, and Lindstrom is not fully match fit. So there's clear differences with what was available to him. Another aspect to consider is that we actually started this Napoli Monza game with our starting squad, whereas in Napoli Spezia, there was a few of the, let's say, starters on the bench, and so it made more sense for Spalletti last year to be a little bit more proactive and bring those guys in before the time that Mazzarri made his first substitutions. Right. But let's move on to another aspect, which is how we dominate the opposition. There's a lot of talk about, oh, last year we used to dominate the opposition much more than we do this year. We're not making as many chances. We're not putting enough pressure on the team. Let's take a look at whether that's the case. Let's take a look at these two very similar games. Again, Napoli Monza versus Napoli Spezia. And let's concentrate a little bit on Napoli right now and what they had to offer. And you guys can see here attempts on goal 25 versus 28 last year, more or less very similar. The attempts on target, last year we had 6 attempts on target. This year 9 attempts on target, so even more on target. 10 corners for Napoli in both last year and this year. 12 crosses last year, 5 of which successful. 14 crosses this year, 7 of which successful, so slightly better. The more or less same number of passes and pass completed, around the 450 mark, both of them, and 88, 90%. Both of them. Passes in the final third, 147 to 147. Guys, these are very, very similar possessions when it comes to the attempts that Napoli had and how we conducted ourselves and how we dominated. So I think it's fake news to say that we were dominating more under Spalletti, at least not in a consistent basis compared to what this team is doing this year. Now, there's a lot of people that say yes, but we don't move the ball as dangerously, we don't move it as fast. Okay, let's take a look at those stats and let's take a look at actually how much of the time we spend in the attacking half. And actually, this year, we spend more time in the opposition attacking half, 57% versus 51% last year. So that tells you a lot of how this Napoli team is dominating the opposition. And guys, by the way, Monza this year is a better team than Spezia last year. In fact, Spezia got relegated. Monza are probably not going to be relegated this year. All right, now let's take a look a little bit more on how we conduct the ball movement, and these are some great stats. Let me focus your attention here on what Serie A defines as dangerosity. I know it's very difficult to read from such a small screen, but it says this is calculated as how much danger the ball can bring when it's on the feet of certain players. And Napoli are this year 68% dangerous, last year 69% dangerous. I know this is very abstract, but if we give stats any sort of importance, let's keep in mind that the way that this is calculated is consistent between the 2 years and they're giving a consistent output. Then it says how dangerous we are in transition. So when we recover the ball, how much are we actually then putting our players in a position to be dangerous? And that's based on how fast the ball is moving, where the players are positioned relative to the other team. So very complex way to calculate this. And apparently we are 61.75% dangerous in transition this year, whereas last year we were only 36% dangerous. So actually we are a bit more dangerous in, let's say, counterattacking or transitioning this year than we were last year. Again, with a caveat that this is both games without Osimhen. With Osimhen, the stats change quite drastically. Now let's look at the ball pace, because a lot of people are saying, well, the ball is not moving as quick as it was last year. Actually, the ball pace this year, 29.88 kilometers per hour. Last year, 29.2 kilometers per hour. Guys, same sort of speed. We're not putting any less pressure on these passes. It's moving at the same speed as it was last year. And the way that we're conducting with ball at the feet on average is at 10.62 kilometers per hour versus last year's 10.26 kilometers per hour. So slightly better this year, even slightly faster, but more or less pretty much the same values. All right. So I know some of you guys are in the American US system where you guys are used to miles per hour. Just the takeaway message is that the ball, whether it's through passes or through carrying the ball, is moving at the same speed as last year. Now, where does then the difference actually lie between these two teams? And I think it's in the riskiness aspect. So here you can see this pass gain amount, and it says it's defined as the number of players overtaken by a vertical pass. Only successful passes are considered. It shows how much a player tends to overcome the opposition's pressure lines. So basically, if I make a pass forward and it only goes through one player, then that counts as one. If it goes through two players, it counts as two, right? So a really good through ball will have a number of maybe three or four, right? You get past more players. This is where it's quite different from last year. Mairo Rui is on top in both cases, but last year his passes forward were passing an average of 4.58 players, and this year 2.98, so two players less. So much less riskiness, much less directness in the pass. And then I think the other major difference is that last year, underneath Mairui, you had our midfield players, Ndombele, Zielinski, Lobotka, right underneath that with 4.25, 4.0, 3.29. So the midfielders were trying to pass the ball forward, trying to get the ball into the spaces more. Whereas this year, if you take a look at who's underneath Mairui, it's Di Lorenzo, Raspadori, and Zerbin. So more of either the front man or the wide players. So there's not enough players in the middle of the field, in the middle of the park, trying to make passes through the lines. So that's a key aspect there. It means that our midfielders, Lobotka, Zielinski, and Anguissa, are not able to find through passes like they were last year. And I'll give you a hint why later on, or my explanation why later on when we unravel some of these stats a little more. There's another thing here called pass riskiness, which is measures the player's propensity to risk the pass. I don't know exactly how they calculate it, but it's clear that last year we were playing a bit more risky passes with Mairo Rui at first place to Elmas in fifth place, the range being between 24 and 30.6%. This year, the range, okay, Mairo Rui and Di Lorenzo, slightly higher riskiness down the flanks, 35 and 31%. But then there's a huge drop off where the fifth place person, in this case Lobotka, is down at 15.71% riskiness, whereas last year the fifth most riskiest person, Elmas, was at 24%. So 15% this year, 24% last year. It's kind of like the fifth player is kind of like the medium player in the team. So the median player in the team last year was risking passes at 24% level, and this year at 15% level, which means that we are not playing as vertically as we can unless we're talking about the wide players. So that's a key difference between these two teams. It's how can we get the central players to play the ball a bit more vertical, a bit more risky down the middle? Then there's another thing that people talk about, which is the athletics department. is this Napoli team actually running less and worse than last year? And are some of these players at a worse condition than they were last time? Well, let's take a look. In the athletics department, and in particular, I want to point out Anguissa. He's the guy that ran the second most out of the Napoli players. He did 10.9 kilometers, all right, which is basically more than second place last year. Last year, Di Lorenzo was in second place at 10.5 kilometers. Now, Di Lorenzo was first this year with 11. But there's a lot of people saying Frank Anguissa, including myself, Frank Anguissa is not running. Actually, he is. He's running a lot. He's also sprinting a lot. And actually, he's not jogging very much at low pace, but which is weird because we keep saying, well, Anguissa, he always jogs at this very low pace. That's not true. I mean, he literally jogs like a kilometer less than maybe a kilometer or two less than maybe some of his other teammates, and actually, he does most of his time running at higher speeds or even sprinting. He sprints more than Kvaratskhelia, for example. So that's very interesting to see. Okay, maybe we're not as fast then as last year. Even that is not true. Our average speed is comparable, maybe even faster than it was last year. For example, Anguissa this year in this game, number five, was number five this year, number five last year with his average speed, and he was doing 10.87 kilometers per hour this year. Last year he did 10.78 kilometers per hour. The difference is zero point 0.1 of a kilometer per hour, but it's in favor of this year. So it's not much. If anything, it shows that his athletic condition is the same this year and last year. And the other players as well. You've got Kvara. Last year was at 10.92. This year he's at 10.89. Guys, we're talking about 0.03 kilometers per hour. Like, these guys are running more or less at the same speed. Zielinski's faster this year. He's at 11.09. Last year he was at 11.02. So there is basically the same speed in these players. These players have not lost their top speed, and it seems like they've also not lost their stamina. So that's another myth that has been debunked. In comparison, by the way, to the other teams, when we look at both what Monza did and Spezia did, like, we are basically on the same level, if not better than these teams in terms of how fast we are, in terms of how much we run. So that's also something that we can't say that we're running less than the other teams, or it's just not true. All right, let's go to some other stats, which is the overall team. Now, in the overall team, as we say, we're actually running more than we were last year. We did in total 108.7 kilometers versus 106.7 last year. So we, as a team, we ran 2 more kilometers, and our average speed was more or less the same. We ran more, we sprinted more, we did a bit less jogging. Now, some people could say, well, this actually shows that last year we were having the ball do more of the movement and less of us having to run around physically. That could be true. The way I interpret this is also that Monza is slightly a better team than Spezia. And so it's clear that this year we had to do a little bit more running around, because Monza are a better team and they do force you to run around a little bit more than Spezia, who sat back much more last year. All right. Speaking of positioning, let's take a look at positioning, because is this team positioned badly? Are they following more or less the same blueprint as we were last year? Let's analyze this aspect. And these are the average positions in the first and second half in both the games. Let's just take a look at the first half. All right, before the craziness of all the substitutions and the time wasting and all that kind of stuff, let's just take a look at how Mr. Spalletti and Mr. Mazzarri set up the team to tackle the game. And you can see the back four is very comparable. Actually, you've got a slight difference of Mairo Rui this year being a bit more further advanced than he was last year, and also maybe a bit more wide than he was last year. Now, this is because I was watching the game at the stadium and it was clear that Monza was packing the middle, and it left Mairui a bit more space on the outsides to do his work, to find some passes, and that's why he was the one with the most number of forward passes, because from that wide position, he was directly trying to find Raspadori or the runs of Zielinski and so on this year. Last year, maybe we didn't use that as much. We allowed ourselves to be compact down the center and just trusted the players in the middle a bit more with the ball, even if it meant that the space was less. But that's a slight difference between this year and last year. And guys, we're talking about differences of maybe 5 or so meters, 15 feet between this year and last year of one player in the back four. But it makes a difference because when you're trying to play a pass, having to go an extra 2 meters a pass makes a difference. It's the difference between a player being able to intercept that pass or not. So it really does make a difference. And we'll see that a bit more later. Now, in terms of the middle three, more or less very similar positions, with the holding midfielder slightly further back. Last year it was actually Ndombele playing further back, and this year it's obviously Lobotka, and then Lobotka came on in the second half. But I mean, it's very clear that we've got this one guy slightly further back, in between almost the two center backs, and then his two, let's say, other midfielders forward in front of him, giving him options. And yeah, it seems like it's a very similar setup from last year. What changes slightly maybe is the attack. Last year we had a front three which was much more flat and wide, and maybe that was used to stretch out the opposition a bit more. This year, both Kvara and in this case Zerbin, who was playing, are a bit tighter, so stretching them a bit less. And Zerbin is actually, his average position is much deeper than what Lozano and Politano were doing last year against Spezia. Maybe this contributed to us in the first half not finding many solutions to open up that Monza defense, because if Zerbin was that far back, it meant that some of the central defenders were a bit less preoccupied with his movement, and could double down a bit more on Raspadori. But overall, I would say these are the differences between the two teams. Interpret them how you will. This is my interpretation of how they impacted how Napoli played. Let's go into now, as a team, not just the individual players, but as a team, how we were positioned. And let's take a look at when we were defending, how deep and wide we were defending. So last year on the right, we were tight at 28.4 meters, and this year we are 30.3. So we are slightly less tight, but more or less it's the same. It's the whole team being just 1 meter less tight in terms of verticalness, and in terms of how tight we are laterally, 37.7 meters this year, 37 meters last year. More or less, we're keeping the same shape as we were last year. Actually, we are slightly more forward when it comes to how we defend this year. Our Bear Center is at 53 meters. Last year it was at 49. So we're even stepping up 4 meters this year compared to last year. We're a bit more, let's say, taking the risk this year when in the way that we defend, even if we don't have a guy like Kim behind us to cover us. Maybe actually that's a problem. We keep saying we need to have a high line, we need to have a high line, and we are doing that. But can we afford to have a high line when an even higher line compared to last year, when we don't have someone like Kim behind us to cover us in counterattacks? And I think that's maybe something that Mazzarri needs to realize, is that we are actually a bit too much forward. Now, why would Mazzarri do this? I think it's because the pressing this year has not been as good from some of our midfielders and front men. And so to compensate and to really try to overcome this difficulty, what Mazzari is doing is saying, okay, let's move the entire team forward, right? Let's move even the center backs forward, and let's squish the opposition a bit more. because we don't have the same maybe intensity in pressing. Let's squish them in terms of where we position ourselves to start with. Now, when we do have the ball, this is where things are a little bit different. And we saw earlier how last year we were a bit wider with our front three compared to how we were in this game. And that shows with the average width. Last year we were wide 45 meters. This year only 38 meters. So there's an entire 7 meters of width that we're not really utilizing to stretch out the back lines. This is important because 7 meters over 3 or 4 players that are in the back line, that means that the space in between players this year that we have to overcome is about 1 or 2 meters less per player. I mean, that makes a huge difference. With 1 or 2 extra meters, basically 6 or 7 feet, you can play a much better pass, a much easier pass through these guys. And I think that shows in the stats of how we were taking less risks this year. And I think it's because actually we didn't create the space to make those risky passes. And in terms of how, let's say, vertical we are, how stretched out we are also 5 meters wider in terms of just verticalness. So we are long 32.7 meters. Last year we were long 27.8 meters. That means that the midfielder this year, not only does he have less space horizontally to try to get a pass through, but there's also more space vertically. So between him and the striker, or between a defender and a midfielder, or a defender and a striker, there's more vertical distance to cover, which means that he doesn't maybe want to play this pass because he sees it as too risky. He has to make it an extra 5 meters longer. So that's about another 15 or so feet longer. That gives the opposition time to intercept. So it's it's small differences. I know it's very numbers based and technical, but just try to picture these distances on the field and how much more difficult it is to pass the ball when a player is standing 15 feet further away than they were last year. Because guys, let's face it, Lobotka is a great midfielder when someone is standing 3 meters in front of him or 10 feet in front of him. But when you make that 20 feet or when you make that 6 meters, then his passes maybe he starts to struggle. Um, I'm a bit exaggerating there, but that's the kind of difficulty that we're dealing with. These are players that Spalletti has put in the ideal condition that emphasizes their strengths, minimizes their weakness, and part of that is just how close the players are to each other. But obviously, guys, there's also, a difference between how Monza play and Spezia play that has to be, considered when we make these type of analysis. So, guys, that is basically it. But we do have one more bit, the shooting. The shooting. Now, guys, we are saying, are we shooting worse in worse positions than last year? Honestly, if we take a look at from where we're shooting from, it seems like we even have more shots inside the box this year than we do last year. So we should be scoring more. Our XG should be higher this year than it was last year. We're actually getting into the box more often than we were last year. The difference maybe is that some of our shots this year are from way wide positions inside the box. Last year, it was basically like, guys, if you are basically on the touchline of the box laterally, don't try the shot. The ones that Kvara and stuff try, don't try them. Only try it if you are a bit more centrally looking at the goal in a bit more of a central position. Maybe it's that. Another thing that I just want to point out is the number of shots that we take from this center piece, this circle position here, which is on the edge of the box centrally. We are not able to find a space to take a shot there. This year, last year, we were doing that a bit more, and I think we really miss a midfielder that could take shots from there. 2 years ago, we had someone like Fabian. We were supposed to get Gabri Vega this year, which is great from that kind of position. This year, we just don't have someone that gets into that central position to take a shot. But Guys, I hope that this shows you what the differences are between last year and this year and kind of convinces you that maybe there's not that much difference between what we were doing last year and this year, and that it's just a matter of details. And hopefully, this team over the next few weeks and months, with a bit more training, with maybe a bit more awareness of these weaknesses and ways to improve the team, they can actually get this improvement done, and we can convert these very, very minor things into things that have big impact, such as goals. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed a bit of a different video. I know it was very heavy on the data, but if you've made it this far, I appreciate you. Thanks for doing this. Have a happy new year. Smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, and as always, Forza Napoli sempre. Ciao.